I'm going to read a chapter from a biography of J. Frank Norris written by Louis Entzminger entitled The J. Frank Norris I Have Known 34 Years. Chapter 16. The Big Banker Who Bought a Dozen Pair of High-Priced Hose for Another Man's Wife. As I said before, Norris did many things that I did not approve, or understand perhaps, I had better say. The picked and stacked grand jury indicted him without any evidence, but indicted him for the purpose of ruining him, as the foreman confessed on the witness stand. Norris did not take it on the chin. He fought back. He got the record of all these perjurers and all these stacked grand jurors and threw everything at his command at them. He had them jumping sideways, turning somersaults, and there were none too high, too wealthy, too influential, provided they had tried to destroy him. He did exactly what Mordecai did to Haman. He did just exactly what Moses did to Pharaoh at the Red Sea. He did just exactly what Samuel did to Agag. Just exactly what David did to Goliath. Just exactly what John the Baptist did when he pointed his unerring finger of judgment in the guilty face of Herod Antipas. There wasn't any cheap sentiment in it, none of this lovey-dovey milk and cider business with him. His enemies were like David's enemies, the enemies of the Lord. I have heard him quote scores of times the 27th Psalm. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident. Perhaps his favorite scripture is Romans 8:31 through 33. What shall we then say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? He that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. It mattered not what happened to him, what slanders, what indictments, what conspiracies, what lies. He could preach with added boldness on Philippians 1:12. But I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel. His crowds increased and conviction deepened, multitudes were saved at every service. His ministry was a perennial fulfillment of the words of Jesus when he said, Go your way, and tell John what things ye have seen and heard, how that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, to the poor the gospel is preached. Luke 7:22. And his people were poor. They were laughed at, ridiculed, criticized. His enemies said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? He boldly answered 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 29. For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world, and the things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. Mrs. J.D. Garrett, one of the greatest women of my acquaintance, a great Bible student, built a large Sunday school class and won many souls. She came to Dr. Norris one day. She worked in the leading department store of the city, W.T. Burton and Company, and said, Do you want something, naming this prominent banker, who was on this grand jury that framed the indictment against you? Dr. Norris welcomed the information. Then she said, This banker bought a dozen pair of high-priced hose, drop-stitch silk hose, for another man's wife. How do I know? because the next day after he bought them, a woman brought them back and said, "I want to exchange these hose I bought from you yesterday for another size." I told her that while you didn't buy them, I will be glad to exchange them. Dr. Norris said, "Mrs. Garrett, would you be willing to stand before the congregation and testify to that?" Mrs. Garrett said yes, even if it cost me my job. And her courage was characteristic of his whole crowd. Dr. Norris had a big black board out in front of the church and had printed in large boxcar letters that could be read across the street these words: "Next Sunday night, should a prominent Fort Worth banker buy high-priced silk hose for another man's wife?" Crowds gathered across the street from the church all during the week. People would drive slowly by and read that sign. Sunday night, not half the people could get in. But something happened before the next Sunday night. Another banker, not the one in question, went to J.T. Pemberton, president of the Farmers and Mechanics National Bank, Dr. Norris's friend, and said, "Jess, I am into it. Norris is going to expose me next Sunday night. My wife will quit me and there will be a run on my bank. I made a mistake when I gave that woman the silk hose." Then a third banker came, who was not the one in question or under suspicion, and came to J.T. Pemberton and pled for him to plead for him. But what is still more surprising, the man in question came to see J.T. Pemberton and said, "Jess, I'm ruined. It'll break my bank." He was president. "And I don't care for myself, but for the sake of my family." Pemberton said to him, "I'd go straight to Norris's office and tell him the whole story. You will find him to be very generous as well as courageous. Confess it all." He said, "I don't care for myself, but I have got one precious daughter and it will be a blot on her forever." Contrary to what Dr. Norris's enemies say, he is a very generous man. I have known him to forgive many bitter enemies, many who sought his life, and baptize them. Sunday night came, the crowds were there, and quietly Dr. Norris asked, "Will Mrs. J.D. Garrett come to the platform?" She told the story of how the silk hose were bought as above described, but he asked her to withhold the name of the banker for the present. After she finished, Dr. Norris quietly said, "Ladies and gentlemen, instead of one banker guilty of buying silk hose for another man's wife, 3 have made confession, and the guilty banker in question has thrown himself on my hands and asked the God of the universe to forgive him, and he has asked for the sake of his family that I withhold his name. I cannot and I will not lift my hand against a man that I believe is sincerely penitent, and the matter is a closed incident." But that bait did go broke. Of course, everybody found out who it was. That man died one of the best, warmest friends that Dr. Norris ever had. Dr. Norris went on and preached that night on "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." A prominent businessman from Minneapolis, Minnesota was in the city and saw the announcement and came to the First Baptist Church as a matter of curiosity. Of course, a subject like that hits everyone more or less. Dr. Norris, in his characteristic manner, as he only can do, took the great audience to the flaming bar of God's almighty judgment. Sinners trembling came running to the front, asking for salvation. This man from Minneapolis, a stranger to Fort Worth, was among those saved, and he went back to Minneapolis, and Dr. William B. Riley baptized him into the First Baptist Church, and he wrote his full testimony. Thus, one of the so-called sensational subjects or exposures of sin resulted in large numbers being saved. But I would not advise any other preacher in the world to follow Norris's methods. Some few fools have tried. Yes, just tried.